Worcester, and I work as an LPN in the urgent care setting. I've worked in urgent care for the last year, and prior to that I worked in family medicine. The urgent care company I work for opened their doors a little over a year ago, and when they opened they were lacking several procedures, including safety procedures. Therefore, I decided to propose a project in which we generate safety procedure manuals that would be placed amongst the 8 clinics and available for personnel to reference on a daily basis. Let's begin this presentation by taking a look at the agenda. First, I'm going to identify the problem, which is the lack of safety procedures within a clinic. I'm then going to take a look at the ramifications or the consequences of this problem. We'll then review the solution that I've generated, and we'll take a look at the budget that will be necessary in order to complete this project. We'll then have an opportunity for questions from the audience. So as I mentioned earlier, the problem is the lack of safety procedures within an urgent care setting. When this happens, there's an increased chance for safety incidents to occur. There's also an increased risk to patients' health, as well as the clinical staff that are administering the care to the patient. There's also the potential for lawsuit. If a patient is harmed within one of our clinics, they may choose to sue the clinic. And as you can imagine, this would have several negative impacts, which we're not going to go into right now, but ultimately would have a negative impact on the clinics. So let's take a look at the first ramification or consequence, and this is the exposure to bloodborne pathogens. In the urgent care setting, we're constantly drawing blood, we're starting IVs, we're giving both vaccines and therapeutic injections, so it's really important that staff understand how that equipment is used. And if there are no safety procedures in place, they may not understand how to utilize those instruments, and that leaves the possibility for there to be some sort of safety incident. There's also the potential for the transfer of infections, hepatitis, HIV, just to name a few. Again, if safety procedures are not in place, there is more risk that there may be, a needle stick in which the staff has now exposed themselves to whatever the patient has, or vice versa. There's also inadequate sterility or contaminated syringes. Staff may not be aware, without procedures in place, that a syringe is a one-time use only. They may attempt to use it several times, and now patient A has given patient B whatever it is they have, and so on and so on. And again, there's the transfer of infections from one patient to the next because we're using a one-time use syringe on several different patients as opposed to disposing of it correctly. That leads me to the last point, and that is improper disposal. Again, if there's no procedures in place to tell you how to appropriately dispose of items, it's potential that sharps are going in the regular trash, or that heavily contaminated material is ending up where it shouldn't be. And again, there's the potential for someone to obtain a needle stick or to come in contact with body fluids because a heavily contaminated item is in the regular trash as opposed to in the hazardous container. The next slide has to deal with supportive evidence, and this is from the World Health Organization in regards to exposure to bloodborne pathogen. And they state that without proper guidelines in place, an employee might think that they can recycle a syringe, like we mentioned earlier, or a disposable needle. In addition, an employee may utilize a contaminated vaccine or diluent. If any of the above actions are taken, it can cause infection as a localized abscess at the injection site. It can cause sepsis. It can also cause toxic shock syndrome. There can be the transfer of infections, like I mentioned, and it can potentially cause death in a patient. So it's an incredibly serious issue, and there needs to be procedures in place in order to prevent the exposure to bloodborne pathogens. The next ramification I'm going to discuss is the inappropriate administration of vaccines. So when procedures are not in place, there is the potential for a staff to administer the wrong vaccine. They may also administer the wrong medication. It may be administered in the wrong place, so they may give a intramuscular vaccine subcutaneously, which is also can have negative impacts on the patient. There are reconstitution errors. So a vaccine that may need to be reconstituted, they may put the wrong item in the vaccine to reconstitute it. And again, this can be a serious issue that can affect the patient. We're going to just take a look at the supportive evidence for this ramification. And again, this comes from the World Health Organization. They state that an injection at the wrong site can cause a reaction or local abscess and potential injury to the sciatic nerve. The results from improper reconstitution include local abscess due to insufficient agitation, possible adverse effect, ineffective vaccine, and potentially death. So again, another serious ramification or consequence of not having safety procedures in place. The next ramification we're going to take a look at is overexposure to radiation. Within our clinic, we do several x-rays. We do general diagnostic x-rays within our clinic, but other clinics may do CAT scans or computed tomography. They may also do MRIs, arthrography, discography, or fluoroscopy. And so it's really important issue to be aware of when radiating someone, that there is the potential for that overexposure. The supportive evidence associated with this ramification is from the IAEA, and they state that high exposures of radiation can cause skin redness, infertility, cataract, and hair loss. There's also an increased risk of cancer, so the more radiation a patient is exposed to, the higher their chance for acquiring cancer becomes. There's also, again, as I mentioned, the number of procedures increases that exposure. So very important that we have procedures in place for X-ray techs to follow so that they're not over-radiating individuals, because the outcome of being over-radiated can be a very negative one. Lastly, or not second to last, we have the collection of body fluids. And this is something that happens on a regular basis within our clinic because it's what allows providers to not only treat the patient, but to give them a diagnosis. So it's really important that procedures are in place, so staff are aware of how to collect the body fluids correctly, but also how to handle them safely so that they're not exposed to them, and how to transport them from our clinic to the lab. So we collect urine, blood, stool, dermal or skin, and sputum, just to name a few. The supportive evidence that goes along with this ramification is from Emmanuel J. Favlero, who's PhD, and he states that patient misidentification errors are potentially associated with the worst clinical outcome due to the potential for misdiagnosis and inappropriate therapy. Again, what I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly important that these specimens are handled properly because the providers really rely on these results in order to diagnose and ultimately treat the patient. And it's really important that in that process, staff are not exposed to those body fluids because, again, there is the risk for being exposed to an infectious disease. The last slide that, or the last ramification I'm going to discuss is inappropriate sanitation. So this covers, kind of a wide range here. First, we're going to discuss just the medical waste, disposal of medical waste, which I mentioned earlier. And this is ensuring that if there's no safety procedures in place, a staff may not be aware that they need to dispose of a needle in the sharps bin or that they need to dispose of heavily contaminated material in the hazardous waste bin. They may also not be aware that they need to clean various body fluids in a certain way. So let's take, for example, a patient who vomits. That patient has C. difficile. The staff come in and they mop that floor. They then go out and mop the lobby. They've now exposed anyone who comes in contact with that lobby to C. difficile, which is a serious illness. So it's important that we have those procedures, those safety procedures in place so that staff can reference them if they have any questions about how we take care of body fluids or how we sanitize rooms. Secondly, there's the hygiene, the personal hygiene of the staff. it's really important that staff are washing their hands every time they come in contact with a patient. Whether they touch a patient, whether they're just speaking to a patient, they're in the room, it's really important because it is the #1 way to prevent the spread of germs. So again, another very serious ramification of safety procedures are not in place. The supportive evidence that goes along with this ramification is also from the World Health Organization, and it states that the management of healthcare waste is an integral part of hospital hygiene and infection control. It also, if safety procedures are not in place, there's potential for contamination. There's also potential for nosocomial infections, which are hospital-acquired infections. And this has to do with like the example I gave earlier, the inappropriate cleaning when someone vomits who has C. diff, because we're now responsible for the transfer of that infection that's now sitting in the lobby. So anybody that comes in contact is now exposed. So now let's move on to the project description. What is it? It's the implementation of safety procedures, which will maintain the safety of both the patient and the clinical staff. It'll be the formulation of a safety committee who will meet and create this safety procedure manual. We will be educating the clinical staff during these meetings about the different departments and the risks that are present when safety procedures are not in place, so that we can then identify those risks and then create procedures for each one of those in order to prevent any safety incidents from happening. And ultimately we'll have the generation of the safety procedure manual. How does it work? Well, the safety procedure manual works in promoting safe and effective patient care. It'll protect the clinical staff that are administering the care as well as the patient, and it will ensure proper administration of vaccines, appropriate blood draw and IV start techniques. It will ensure correct specimen collection and appropriate sanitation, all of which are very important. The solution. Establishment of safety procedures will help prevent safety incidents from occurring within the clinic, and therefore ensuring that we provide the highest standard of patient care. The budget. So in order to complete this project, we're going to need a few different items. We will need binders. This will help us in documenting our meeting notes. It will also help us in kind of organizing the final safety procedure manual that we will then send to corporate for official review. We'll need whiteboards, again, for meeting notes, for brainstorming any ideas the group may have. Laptop computers will be necessary, again, for meeting notes, also for us to do research and any group presentations so that we can share the information that we find. We'll need an overhead projector to do those group presentations. And so the total cost per clinic will be $10,895. We have 8 clinics, so it'll be $10,895 per clinic. I have now listed kind of a chart here in which I spell out what it is we need, how many we will need, the cost for each clinic location, and then why we need those items and what we will be using them for. So I'm going to conclude this project by just discussing kind of the conclusion to everything. And that is that this project will ensure both clinical staff and patient safety, as I mentioned earlier. It'll also maintain an environment in which patients will receive the higher standard of care. And the implementation of safety procedures will also help to prevent the potential for safety incidents that could lead to potential lawsuits, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So ultimately, safety procedures are incredibly important, and they will help to prevent safety incidents both for the patient and for the clinical staff. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching, and at this point I will take any questions from the audience.